أهلا ومرحبا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. كان هناك وقت حيث كان فيه كل الأمريكيين تقريبا يتجمعون حول أجهزة التلفزيون الخاصة بهم في الساعة 36 من مساء كل ليلة ليشاركوا في التجربة الوطنية المتمثلة بمشاهدة نشر أخبار المساء. كان هناك وقت حيث كان بإمكان الأمريكيين فيه مشاهدة أي قناة يريدونها طالما كانت إحدى شبكات الأخبار الثلاث الرئيسية. لقد كان هناك وقت حيث كان فيه الأشخاص الأكثر جدارة بالثقة في أمريكا هم رجال الإعلام. نعم، كلهم رجال تقريبا، ولم تكن نزاهتهم وتوازنهم وهيادهم موضع شك أبدا. كان ذلك قبل فترة طويلة، قبل أن تصل الأخبار عبر قنوات الكابل ويبدأ الأمريكيون انحدارهم الطويل نحو القبلية السياسية والثقافية. وخلال تلك الفترة كان أحد الأشخاص الأكثر ثقة في أمريكا هو ضيفنا هذا الأسبوع في برنامج داخل واشنطن للحديث عن وسائل الإعلام والسياسة الأمريكية والسياسة الخارجية. يسعدني أن أستضيف كبير المراسلين الدبلوماسيين السابقين ورئيس مكتب موسكو ومضيف برنامج مكتب لفترة طويلة، مارفن كالب. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. Today we have a special treat. From Edward R. Murrow to Walter Cronkite to the explosion of cable news, Marvin Kalb has seen it all and done it all in a career spanning more than 7 decades. I am delighted to have you back on Dakhel, Washington. Marvin, welcome.
Thank you very much, Rob. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So let me just start by noting that Donald Trump is, by my count, the 13th president of your professional career. Any comment, Marvin?
Well, it's all been dazzling. Everything has happened so very quickly. He's thrown so many things up in the air that it's difficult to fasten onto a single one. But there is an underlying current and direction. The president is clearly trying to concentrate as much power as he can in the White House, in the executive branch of government. It is still open as to whether the other two branches of government, which are supposed to be equal in the US system of governance, whether the other two branches will fight back. And at the moment, they have not.
Does he remind you of any one of the other dozen presidents that you saw work in office?
Not really. I think that Trump is unique. And the reason I say that is I have a very strong impression that we are dealing with a person who thinks a great deal about himself as the prime actor. In other words, the people around him and Trump himself regard him as a great negotiator, as a great genius, somebody who understands everything. And that means that people are reluctant to criticize him. People are reluctant to say, Mr. President, that might not be the best idea. Maybe we ought to try this. And when there are not questions raised early on, close to the president, by people he trusts, then the president's natural instincts, in this case Trump, will be to go on and believe that what he is doing is right, not only for himself, but for the country. And he may be very, very wrong. And so you've got to be careful at this point. I think it is a dangerous moment in American history. And we have to be mindful of the danger, but not be so captivated by the danger as to stop thinking, but to keep thinking and to keep questioning.
Marvin, what do you think about President Trump's approach to the media and the media's approach to him?
Well, at the moment, the media's approach to him is obsequious. In my judgment, most of what the press is doing, and when you use the word media, you're encompassing everything, and that's correct to do that. But at this point, President Trump believes that he ought to be in control of the media, by which I mean he thinks that the media should criticize him, but only up to a point, that it can't go too far, that it can't undercut him. I think that is profoundly wrong. Part of the American system of governance is that within it is an understanding that the press has the freedom to criticize without restriction, certainly without government restriction. There sometimes is a restriction which the reporter feels himself, that I'm doing something that might not be right. Then the reporter can pull back. But the reporter ought not to be pulling back because of pressure from the government. And at the moment, what I see is that the pressure is real, and the media, starting with ABC News and now CBS News, where I spent 25 years of my life, CBS News is about to capitulate as well to the president on an issue that it should never move on. If you do an interview and you have tapes, we're talking, Rob, and there's tapes of this interview. That tape should be in your hands, not in the hands of the government. And in this case, the government wants the tape, and CBS in the old days would have said without any doubt, no. But today, it probably is going to capitulate. That means there is fear in the newsrooms of America, and that is a profound danger to American democracy.
Very strong words, Marvin. Um, Listen, with the explosion of sources of news or what passes for news, how do you get your news today?
I get my news, but look, I'm an old man and I just sit around doing things the way old men do. But what I try to do is first, there are two newspapers that are in the house. So there's the Washington Post and the New York Times. Also, there is NPR radio. Also, there's this extraordinary thing that we're talking through right now. There is Zoom, and there are countless outlets. And if you keep an eye on one or two of the outlets that you regard as reliable, I think that you're going to be a very well educated person. You would be well informed, but it takes time. It really takes a great deal of time now to stay informed. And I don't have that time. I'm sort of busy, and I know you are, but there are a lot of people who ought to be able to sit back and absorb the complexity and the historic potential changes taking place in the United States.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, let's shift gears for a moment. You have a terrific new book out, which is A Different Russia, Khrushchev and Kennedy on a Collision Course.
There
There
you
you
go.
go. Thank you very much. I appreciate you showing it to all of our viewers. And this is drawn from, at least in part, it's drawn from your experience as being a Moscow bureau chief at the height, or maybe the depth, of the Cold War. Um, uh, uh, a terrific story you tell of America and the Soviet Union on the brink of apocalypse.
Yeah.
And you were there.
Yes.
And you knew Khrushchev.
Yes.
Quite unlike almost any other American. How close were we, in your view, to nuclear war?
I think we were a day away from it. The nuclear war that I fear that the entire world feared was in late October of 1962. We were, as you say, in the depths of the Cold War, and Nikita Khrushchev was the leader of the Soviet Union. He was a short, roly, energetic, pugnacious, totally devout communist. But unlike the ruler of Russia today, Vladimir Putin, Nikita Khrushchev wanted to have good relations with the West. He wanted very much to sit down with American presidents and try to resolve all difficulties. Clearly, he wanted the advantage to go to the Soviet Union, but he was open to the negotiation, and he would do it openly. And he welcomed American artists and athletes and scholars and journalists to be in Russia. Today, there are very, very few foreign journalists in Moscow. And the upshot, Rob, is that the people around the world, especially the American people now, have no real knowledge of what is happening in Russia on a day-to-day basis. There are no reporters there to tell them the news. In those days, there were 16 American reporters. I was one of them. And we were able to get close to Khrushchev. He wanted the news out, so he wanted us close to him. And when I first met him, which was at the July 4th party in Moscow at Spaso House, where the American ambassador lives, and Khrushchev arrived. He was the first Russian leader ever to recognize the July 4th holiday. So it was a big deal for us. And he comes in, and because I speak Russian, I had to be the host for Marshal Zhukov, the defense minister, the great hero of World War II. And Marshal Zhukov was about 5'6" in height, as Khrushchev was. And I was 6'3". So Khrushchev, Zhukov was drinking a lot of vodka. I was drinking a lot of water. He did not know the difference. And he introduced me to Khrushchev, and he said, "Hey, I have finally found a young American who can drink like a Russian." Khrushchev loved that. And he said, "By the way, how tall are you?" And I said, "I'm 3 centimeters shorter than Peter the Great." Oh, he thought that was a great answer. And from then on, when I came back as a journalist, from that moment on, when Khrushchev would see me, he would beckon and say, "Here comes the great Peter the Great, let him come over." And so I was able, in that way, to sort of establish a little bit of a personal relationship. And I could tell early on that he wanted very much to strike a deal with Kennedy. And then there was the drama of these two men, Kennedy on the one side, Khrushchev on the other. They met at a summit in Vienna in June of 1961. The summit, as I recall, the excitement in Vienna was extraordinary that weekend. And everybody on Saturday believed great things were going to happen. But by Sunday night, I got through to one Russian and I said, "How are things going?" And Khrushchev left in a state of disappointment. But he used 3 words to describe Kennedy. He said, "He is young," that's obvious, "inexperienced, and weak." For a Russian leader to judge the American leader as weak represented an opening. And he was determined to take full advantage of the opening. And he began to think of ways of doing that. The big issue was the division of Berlin. Khrushchev decided to build a wall through Berlin, which went from August of 1961 to 1989. And in that period of time, East and West were blocked from each other till the wall went down.
and of course the great moment of tension in the end of October, the missile crisis between the United States, Cuba, the Soviet Union. We're going to talk about this when we come back after the break. But what I really want to get to is drawing the lesson of that for today's crisis. Khrushchev, Putin, Kennedy, Trump. Are we likely to have another face-off between leaders 70 years later? We'll be back with Marvin Kalb, and we'll discuss this in just a moment. My guest this week is Marvin Kalb. Marvin is the Dean of American Broadcast Journalists, having served more than 30 years as correspondent at CBS News, where he was Moscow bureau chief, and then host of the flagship show Meet the Press on NBC News. He is a former Murrow boy, indeed the last of the Murrow boys. He had a long and distinguished career in academia, too. First at Harvard University, where he's the founding director of the Shorenstein Center, and later here in Washington at George Washington University. He's the author of numerous books. Marvin is a close friend and a close friend of this show. Indeed, he was one of the first guests on Dakhel, Washington, nearly 20 years ago, and I'm delighted to have him back. Marvin, Khrushchev, Putin, Kennedy, Trump, parallels, contradictions, what do you see?
Well, if we go back for a moment to the story of these two men, Khrushchev and Kennedy, when Khrushchev, after building the wall in Berlin, took it into his head that he can take Kennedy to the cleaners, he could really take advantage of Kennedy. How? He was told that the Americans had put Jupiter missiles in Turkey, pointed at the Soviet Union, and he said, "I'm going to run hedgehogs down Uncle Sam's pants." He was very furious. And he took it into his head that if America could have missiles in Turkey, he could have missiles in Cuba, and that could reorganize the strategic balance, which had tilted in America's favor. He wanted it to tilt in Russia's favor. He moved 50,000 troops, missiles, some of them nuclear warheaded, into Cuba. Very few people caught it until the very end. And when they did spot it, Kennedy said, "Out you go." And for 7 days, from October 22nd to the 28th, I can only tell you that in Moscow at that time, the tension was so extraordinary. You almost breathed it. It was part of the air. And day by day, I was picking up signs that Khrushchev wanted to get out of this mess that he had created. And each day there was an opportunity, and each day Khrushchev said, "Let's talk." And Kennedy said, "Not until you pull the missiles out." So the man he judged to be weak proved to be very strong at the key moment. And by Sunday of that week, he decided, Khrushchev did, to fold. If he had not folded on that Sunday, Kennedy was obliged the following day to take action against Cuba. That would have meant against Soviet personnel. That could very well instantly have led to an exchange directly between Russia and the United States. But Khrushchev had the guts. He had the guts publicly to pull out and to acknowledge that he made a mistake. Question. Supposing Vladimir Putin had been the Russian leader at that time, not Nikita Khrushchev. In other words, a Russian leader not eager to strike a deal with the West, a tough guy capable of invading a neighbor in order to get his way. Would he have pulled Russian missiles out of Cuba? The odds are he would not have. And what we would have faced then, back in '62, would have been a nuclear war. And right now, we are facing that Russian leader. I think it's an incredibly dangerous time. We do not really know what it is that he's going to do. He has hinted he might use tactical nuclear weapons. President Biden, in his time in office, said, don't go down that street. Don't do that. That would be a horrible mistake. I hope that President Trump is passing that same message on to Putin now, but I don't know.
Do you think, Marvin, based on your experience, that Presidents Trump and Putin can reach a deal over Ukraine the way Presidents Khrushchev and Kennedy reached a deal over nuclear-tipped missiles?
I do, but I think it is likely to be at a very great cost. I believe right now there are overlapping positions between Putin and Trump on Ukraine. Number one, I think Trump is perfectly willing to agree that Russia keep 20% of Ukrainian territory that it has already conquered, because Putin has said he's not pulling out. I think Trump will accept that. Secondly, Putin has insisted that part of the deal be an acceptance of Ukraine as a neutral nation, not in any formal relationship with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And I believe that Trump would buy that. Now, this would all be done with Ukraine on the sidelines, Ukraine not being a party to the negotiation. But logically, given those two factors, Ukraine is going to feel betrayed. And the United States of America has said we are going to be there to help Ukraine. And if in the final analysis we are proven not to be very reliable, that will have terrible consequences for the U.S. position all around the world, and particularly for NATO, which would feel that it could no longer depend on the United States. So Trump, being quite transactional, would want very much to have a deal, the deal being the end of the war. This would be the end of the war, but it would be an end that the key party to the war, Ukraine, would not fundamentally accept.
I apologize, we only have a few seconds left. I did want to ask you this. You know, everyone laments the state of journalism today. Is anything better today than it was 50, 60, 70 years ago in terms of reporting or delivering the news?
The fundamental responsibility of the news is still to get the new information and present it as fairly as possible. There we're in trouble.
And there you go. Marvin Kalb, it's a real pleasure to have you with me on Dakhel, Washington, as we say, to 120, Marvin. Wishing you all the best.
Thank you.
وإلى هنا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة لبرنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كانت لديكم أسئلة أو استفسارات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول العلاقة بين إدارة ترامب ووسائل الإعلام، أرجو التواصل معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو مباشرة @RobSatloff. وحتى نلتقي في الأسبوع القادم، شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.